So we'll begin our recording, and we're glad that you have joined us today, or if you're watching this later on YouTube, we're glad that you have stopped by. And we are continuing our series now on the 10 Commandments, and we are now looking at the second commandment. And this commandment says, it's found in two different places, in Exodus 20 verses 4 through 6, and it's also found in Deuteronomy chapter 5. The 10 Commandments is found in Deuteronomy chapter 5 and also in Exodus chapter 20. So I'll read the Exodus version of this second commandment. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. It's been said that the history of the human race has been a history of its idolatry. Each generation seems to reproduce its own idols in one form or another. And so when we come to the second commandment, that's what's being addressed today, is idolatry. And this was also addressed in the first commandment as well. You remember, you shall have no other gods before me. In the verse before this, Exodus chapter 20, verse 3. So in light of this commandment here, the second commandment, you might ask the question, what's the point of giving the second commandment? If we're to have no other gods, the first commandment, in his sight or before him, we learn that means in his sight. Certainly that implies that we are not to have carved images of other gods and worship them. So why does God distinguish between these two commands? Well, we can be assured that God doesn't repeat himself. He's not redundant without reason or unnecessarily. These two commandments, even though they're addressing similar issues, they're not speaking to exactly the same thing. And so in our study today, I want to consider these things. I want to answer the question, or the questions, why did God give us the second commandment? As I just said, isn't that saying the same thing as the first commandment? You shall not have any other God before me. Isn't it saying the same thing? And then I want to look at the number two, the general meaning of the second commandment. We'll talk about its meaning. And then I want to look at the purpose. Why did God give us this commandment? What's the whole reason behind it? And then fourthly, I want to, at the very end, make some applications, as I always try to do, apply whatever we learn to the lesson itself. So the first question we want to answer is, why did God give us this second commandment? What is why did he give it? Well, God, as I said, never repeats himself unnecessarily. And you might say, well, when he says, you shall have no other gods before me, the first commandment, isn't that implying that we're not to have any carved images and worship them? So how do you distinguish between these two commandments? Well, again, like I said, God doesn't repeat himself unnecessarily or without reason. The first commandment speaks to the object of our worship. The focus of the first commandment is who we are to worship. We are to worship God. And we saw that we are not to have any other God in his sight. We can't worship any other God. It's not just you can worship another God as long as we don't put that God before him. No, we can't have any other God at all. And so that was the focus of the first commandment. But the second commandment speaks of the manner or the mode of our worship. In other words, how we are to worship. That's the focus of the second commandment. Now, the first commandment makes it clear who we are to worship. And as I said, we see this time and again. And people understand that they're not to worship anything else. But what we're seeing in the second commandment is how we are to worship, the manner. And so God knew that all of us have an inclination to worship. And God knew that if we worshiped him, there would also be this temptation that we make some kind of image. We would say, well, we can't understand God fully. And so he knew there would be this temptation to try to reduce him to a size that we could understand, and do this by making images of him, making God, you might say, man-sized. And so that's really the focus of the second commandment. So let's look at the general meaning of the second commandment. What does it mean? Well, negatively, what does it not mean? Some say that what the second commandment forbids is any kind of visual art or image of any kind. But there's nothing in the Bible that suggests making visual representations or images or art is always wrong. If you just stopped at verse 4 and you stopped right there, you might get the idea that any kind of image is wrong. But you have to understand that he also goes on to elaborate on this commandment in verses 5 and 6. And this is exactly what the Muslims believe. The Muslims believe that any kind of art, anywhere, at any time, is forbidden. But there's nothing in God's word that suggests that all art or visual art of any kind is always sin. For example, in the Old Testament, Jacob set up a memorial pillar over his wife Rachel's tomb. Samuel set up a memorial, and he called that stone, you remember, Ebenezer, which means thus far the Lord has helped us. 12 stones were set up to ratify the covenant between Israel and God in Exodus 24, just 4 more chapters. Jacob and Laban set up a stone memorial as well, or they made a covenant, a stone covenant, and they set up a stone memorial. It's what's interesting about all these examples that I've just told you about in the Old Testament is that the very same word that is used here to condemn carved images is the very same word that's used in these other places where Jacob set up a stone memorial for his wife Rachel, and where Laban and Jacob set up a memorial to ratify their covenant as well. So it's the exact same word. So we see that just the setting up of stones in itself is not prohibited by this command. It's the purpose behind these stones or these stone memorials. That's the issue. The issue is what was made of them. What was their use? We also see this is true of visual art and images in general. God himself even required Israel to make visual arts and images in the context also of their worship. For example, God commanded that cherubim of gold, 2 angels of gold, be placed on either side of the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant. And we also know that cherubim were placed and woven within the curtains of the tabernacle. The lampstands in the holy place were to have 6 branches of a tree, and there were cups that were to be fashioned like almond blossoms. See, that's art. Later, Solomon in his temple, around his throne, there was cedar carved with ornamental buds and flowers, and he even had visual art of lions going up to his throne. And we read even in 1 Kings chapter 6, many more visual images and arts inside the sanctuary itself. They had palm trees, flowers were all displayed. These are all images. This is visual art. In fact, the art in the temple and in the tabernacle itself recalled the Garden of Eden. You remember the cherubim guarded the entrance into the Garden of Eden. They were not allowed back into the Garden of Eden after Adam and Eve sinned. And these cherubim are recalling that very thing. Cherubim are angels. And so the temple, the tabernacle themselves, they served as images of the Garden of Eden, and they had a lot of images. They recalled its beautiful vegetation and so on. So, and you remember there's another incident in the wilderness when the children of Israel murmured against God, and God was very angry with them complaining, and some of them died. They got bitten by poisonous snakes and died. Well, anyway, the people cried out to God because a lot of them were dying, and God he had Moses make a bronze snake and set it up on the top of a pole, and anyone that was bitten by a poisonous snake could go look at this bronze snake and they would be healed. They wouldn't die from their poisonous snake bite. Well, you see, that's an image, isn't it? That bronze snake was an image. So you might say, well, in this instance, God again commanded the making of an image. And in the New Testament, we find the New Testament goes even further, and it says that bronze snake also was a picture of Jesus, who was lifted up and died in our place. And so all who look to him by faith have eternal life. So you see these examples. Now, why do I go through all of this? Why do I go through showing that setting up of stone memorials is not necessarily wrong? Visual art and images in general, they're not wrong. Why do I want to say all that? If they were wrong, God wouldn't have commanded them to be made in the first place. You see, if just all visual art and images, like the Muslims say, is wrong. So why are they wrong? What is being commanded in this second commandment? What's being forbidden? Well, you might say, some people might say, well, visual arts and images are only permissible and they're legitimate when God commands them to be made. But we have a lot of examples in scripture of art and images, like Solomon's temple and different things, and Laban and Jacob setting up these memorials. They weren't commanded by God, and yet there's no condemnation by God of them as well. So it's not just making a stone image. It's not just visual art. That's not what's wrong. Art in homes or in our society, in other words, is not wrong. It's not a violation of this second commandment, like the Muslims say. Someone else says, well, it's not wrong to display art and images in our homes and in society, but it's wrong to display art in a place of worship. Well, I think we have to be careful here, because God himself, as we said, required artwork in a place of worship in the Old Testament. And so we have to at least conclude that there's nothing intrinsically wrong with that. And so just having artwork, you might say architecture itself in a building is artwork. And so just the artwork itself, or visual art, is not wrong in and of itself. So if it's not wrong to display art or visual aids, what is this commandment forbidding? So let's look positively. What does it mean? Well, the key issue here is the purpose or the use of the visual art or image. You see, the command is we're not to make images for the purpose of bowing down to them to worship them, or to use images, even if they weren't made for that purpose, then start using them for that purpose. And there's two things here that make this clear. And the first is this idea of this word translated carved image in verse 4. A carved image is always used in the Old Testament for an image that is used for idolatrous practices. You see, it's never used, this word is never used for an innocent piece of work, artwork. It's always something that is used to worship. And we've seen this connection also in verses 4 and 5. Now, here's the command in verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image. And again, it always, in the Bible, it's always used, that word that's translated carved image is always used for anything that is used for idolatrous purposes, for worshiping. And he says, you cannot make these carved images in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. But we need to remember now that verses 5 and 6 are an elaboration and an explanation of verse 4. So look at verse 5. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. There's the idea right there. That's what makes these things wrong. When you start bowing down to some stones that you set up, or some artwork, piece of art or any image you see. And this is made very clear in Leviticus 26, verse 1, when God says, do not make idols or set up an image or a sacred stone for yourselves. Now that's what we're talking about, right? Don't set up an image, or we talked about sacred stone. You see, a stone that you would worship for yourselves. Do not place a carved stone in your land to bow down in your land, to bow down before it. I am the Lord your God. So we see this is even confirmed in the Old Testament and even in the New Testament when we read about gods of gold or gods of cast metal, gods of silver. You see, they're images, they're idols, they're visual displays that are for the purpose of worship. And they're not just art in and of themselves. That's what is being condemned here. So, what does this second commandment forbid? Well, let's break it down just a little bit more than that even. First of all, this second commandment it's obvious that it condemns any worship of an image of a false god. Now that's obvious. We wouldn't need, I don't think, really the second commandment to condemn that, because that's also included in the first commandment. You see, it's a violation of the second commandment to worship an image that is meant to represent, in other words, a Roman god or a false god or an African god. Any god of any kind is not to be worshiped in any way. Those images are not to be worshiped at all. But the first commandment has already told us that we can't have any other gods but Yahweh himself. And so there's something more to this second commandment, and we've already seen it. But the second commandment also condemns the worship of the one true living God by means of images. We're not to worship, the first commandment, we're not to worship any other God. But you see, we're not even to worship the true God, the only God we are to worship, by means of images or visual art. In fact, there are references to this in the Old Testament, and there are many cases where people tried to worship Yahweh, the true God, the living God, by means of images. In Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 15 through 19, and then verse 36, listen to what God said, what Moses is preaching to the people. This is his last sermon before he dies. He said, you saw no form of any kind on the day God spoke to you at Horeb, which is another name for Mount Sinai. This is really important. Those are important words right there. Moses saying, you never saw any form of any kind when the Lord was speaking to you out of the fire. He says, therefore, what should you learn from this? Watch yourselves very carefully, so that you do not become corrupt and make for yourselves an idol, an image of any shape, whether formed like a man or a woman, or like any animal on earth, or any bird that flies in the air, or any creature that moves along the ground, or any fish in the waters below. And when you look, that sounds very similar to what he's going to say in the next chapter, doesn't he? When he he gives the second commandment, or what we've just read in Exodus 20. Same thing. Don't make an image in the form of anything in heaven above, earth beneath, the water below. Remember, he's saying the same thing here. And this is the chapter before the 10 commandments, but it's telling us again why. He says, verse 19, and when you look up to the sky and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the heavenly array, do not be enticed into bowing down to them and worshiping things the Lord your God has appointed to all nations under heaven. From heaven, verse 36, he made you hear his voice to discipline you. You heard his voice, you see, you heard it, but you didn't see anything. You didn't see a form. On earth, he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words out from the fire. So we're getting down to what it does mean, you see. Negatively, it's telling us we can't worship anything at all. Even we can't worship a false god anyway, but we can't even worship God, the true God, in the form of an image or some kind of visual art. And so, in other words, idolatry consists not only of the worship of false gods, but also the worship of the true God by means of images of any kind. Can you see that that is what the second commandment is forbidding? Now, we have several examples of this in the Bible, and I'll just mention a couple quickly. First of all, idolatry consists not only of worshiping a false god of any kind. No, we can't do that. We can't make an image of Zeus or something and bow down to them. No. But also worshiping only the true God. You say, well, I don't worship all those false gods. I only worship God, but I have an image of God that I'm bound. No, you can't even do that. You see how the second commandment is talking about worship, how we are to worship God. Can't even worship him, the true God, try to do it by means. And we got examples of this. Look at this, Exodus 32, verse 5. You remember when Moses goes back up to the mountain and Aaron and the people built this golden calf? What does it say? Aaron built an altar in front of the calf and announced, tomorrow will be a festival to Yahweh. It was a golden calf, but it was dedicated to whom? Yahweh. You see, it was the worship of Yahweh by the image of a golden calf. And God was very angry. You see, so here we have an attempt they were violating the second commandment. They were worshiping one true God, the first God. They didn't, you can't say, well, they were worshiping other gods. The first commandment, no. They were trying to worship Yahweh, but they were violating the second commandment. They were doing it by means of an image. And there's another example. This is not as well a known example in Judges 17 and 18. But it has to do with a man named Micah and his mother. And it just goes to show this period is called the Dark Ages of Israel's history, because in those days that you have this repeated refrain throughout Judges. There was no king in Israel. Everybody did what was right in his own eyes. And so you have these stories all the way through Judges. Well, at the very end of Judges, one of the last stories is about this guy Micah, and he steals his mother's silver, steals from his own mother. And then he felt bad about it. He gives it back to her. And then she dedicated it to Yahweh. And so she blessed her son Micah now in the name of Yahweh, the true God. And she says in that passage, now I am dedicating, I've dedicated this silver by my hand to Yahweh for my son to make a carved image and a mold image. And so that's what they did. They made a carved image that was to represent Yahweh. And then later on, there was this vagabond Levite from the hill country of Ephraim, and he's traveling through there. And all of a sudden, Micah says, hey, why don't you come and be my personal Levite and priest? And he says, sure, I'll do that. Anyway, it's just an example, you see, of worshiping not false gods, the true God, but by use of images. You see, that's what the second commandment condemns. And we see it also in this very, very well-known part of the Old Testament of Jeroboam, when he divided the kingdom. There was a civil war, you might say. Anyway, there was a division, and he became king of the northern part of Israel. And he was afraid people would go back to Jerusalem on the holidays, religious holidays, and worship God, Yahweh, in Jerusalem, like they were supposed to. And so what did he do? He made 2 golden calves. He got that, I'm sure, from Egypt, in Exodus 32, when Aaron did that. And he dedicated these 2 golden calves to Yahweh, not a false God. He dedicated them to the true God. He wanted them to have a visual sign of Yahweh, and then he ordained his own priests who weren't from the tribe of Levi, and he set up his own holidays and so forth. And he said, hey, don't go down there, worship God here. And it was very successful in getting people to commit idolatry. And so all of these are examples, you see, and these are just 3 examples in the Old Testament, but they're examples of not just worshiping a false god like Zeus or Baal or someone like that by the use of images, but trying to worship the true God by use of images. And we see that it is strongly condemned and prohibited in the Old Testament. It makes God very angry. And this, so we see this. And the third thing that we see is that this command condemns the worship of images of any kind, no matter what they represent. You say, well, we're going to bow down and worship it, and it doesn't represent a false god, and it doesn't represent God, but we're going to worship it. Well, that's also condemned in this commandment. Nothing is to be worshiped besides God. No image at all. And we've seen that God, he doesn't condemn visual art or images per se, because we've already seen there's many examples of that were not condemned in Scripture. But it is wrong to take a legitimate artwork and then start using that as a means of worship. And this can be illustrated by the bronze serpent that we talked about earlier. Now, God commanded this bronze serpent to be made. You remember they're complaining, and God is angry, and he sends these poisonous snakes, and they're dying. But now they say, we're sorry. And so God said, okay, make this bronze snake. And if you get bitten by a poisonous snake now, you just look up at that bronze snake and you'll be healed. And so that's what they did. Well, guess what? Now, God commanded that to be built. They weren't worshiping any false god, and they weren't worshiping God when they looked at that bronze snake. But I'll tell you what happened. When you read down through history, several hundred years, they still had that bronze snake, and people started worshiping it. They called it Nehushtan. It became an object of worship. And good King Hezekiah, when he wanted to start a revival in Israel, you know what he did? He had that thing destroyed. Something God made, commanded that they make, he destroyed it because people had started worshiping it. And so what do we see? Look at these things. It condemns the worship of any false god. But of course, the first commandment already told us we can't have any other god. But we see that it also condemns the worship of the one true living God by means of images. You can't make an image that tries to represent him either. And it also condemns images of any kind, even if it's not to worship God or if it's not a false God. You can't bow down and worship any image. And we see that as well. So can you see, it's the use of the image. It's not the object itself that is condemned. It's what you're using that image for. And you might say it's the misuse of this image that is a violation of the second commandment. So there you have it in those things right there. That's the general meaning of the second commandment. So now let's talk about the purpose of the second commandment. Why is God so concerned about this? Why are images forbidden by God? Why does he so strongly disapprove of the worship of images of himself? What's at stake here anyway? Is this some just arbitrary commandment that God gives us because he's self-conscious and he doesn't like people to take pictures of him or make pictures of himself? You know, a lot of people in that way, they're camera shy, aren't they? You whip out a camera, you start to take a picture, they hide. Oh, I don't want to be in that picture. And they turn, we all know people like this. Is that what God's problem is? He just doesn't, he just doesn't like people to make pictures of himself? No, there's reasons. There's really, really good reasons that God forbids the worship of images. And so I want to look at that and then look at some present day modern applications of this. And so first of all, the reason God forbids the worship of images, him by images, is that images dishonor him by obscuring his glory. And this is exactly what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 23. Listen to what he says. For although they knew God, they neither glorified him. We're saying that images, you try to worship God by means of an image, and you are obscuring his glory. They neither glorified him as God, nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Although they claimed to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God, that means he never dies, he's eternal, for images. They're exchanging the glory of an immortal God for images made to look like mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. You see, Paul is speaking about worshiping God by images, and he describes it as changing or exchanging the glory of the immortal God by an image. And one is the image of a mortal human, but anything in heaven flying around or swimming in the ocean or anywhere else on the earth. They're not to do this. To do this is to depict God in a way not like the one who created all these things. God is not like any of these things, including people. When you make an image of God and make him look like a human, it's degrading to God because he is not like that. And a great example of this is, again, this example in Exodus 32. Remember, they made a calf, but remember that golden calf was intended to represent Yahweh, to honor him. They said, this is your God. And a bull calf, I'm sure, was intended to worship Yahweh by bringing to their minds his strength, because you know a bull is strong. But that is nothing compared to Yahweh's strength. Can you see that you've exchanged the glory of God's strength for a weak little bull? But let's go on. This says nothing. Okay, let's say you're honoring his strength in an image. But what about God's moral character? What about his glory? Is that being shown in a bull? What about his righteousness, his goodness, his mercy, his grace, his love, his patience, his wrath against sin, his justice, his holiness, his omnipresence, his self-sufficiency, his immutability, his transcendence, and on we could go. What about all of those attributes? You see, those and many others are not captured in the image of a bull. Even if you thought, well, no, his strength is captured in a bull, which I deny, but all of those others aren't captured in it. You see, when you make an image, you can never capture the reality of who God is. And God, in Isaiah 40, this chapter is a scathing rebuke of images, just mocks images. And one of the verses in there, God says, with whom then will you compare God? Or what image will you liken him? I'll tell you what, it is impossible to compare God to anything in heaven, on earth, or in the sea. You could never do it. I heard a story about the great Picasso, and a man wanted him to paint a picture of his wife. And when the man came to pick up the painting, the husband complained that the painting didn't look like his wife. And Picasso says, well, what does she look like? And the man took out a picture of his in his wallet of his wife. And he says, well, she looks like that. And Picasso looked at it and he said, she sure is small, isn't she? What's the point that Picasso was making? You see, even a photo doesn't look like a person. You know, people are bigger than photos, aren't they? So they're not that little. A photo is two-dimensional, not three-dimensional. A photo isn't life-sized. A photo isn't alive. There's no movement in a photo. You see, at best, what Picasso was actually saying is it's only a snippet of the real thing. Well, the same thing is true, but to an infinite degree, of any image of God. Except images of God are actually gross distortions of God. Now, this doesn't mean we can't take pictures of our family, hang them up on the wall. You see, none of that, and remind us of them. There's nothing wrong with that, even though they are distortions really of the real thing. But I'll tell you what, we can't do that of God. We'd be breaking this second commandment. And all images are such a gross distortion of God. We're going to see it also leads to very evil character as well. We'll see that here in a moment, God willing. But they grossly misrepresent God and who he is. So whatever we think of pictures from a cultural standpoint, we are not to look to pictures of God to move us to worship him. His glory is so great that pictures could never show us that glory. And so God gave us the second commandment graciously so that it would not distort our thinking of God. But in the second place, we also see that images dishonor God because they're impersonal and lifeless. You know what the Bible says about God all the way through Old and New Testament? He is constantly referred to as a living God. It's just amazing and I many times will say this in my prayers, if you've heard me in my teaching. He's a living God. And one of the constant critiques of these images in the Bible is they're not living. This is one of the things that the preachers in the Old Testament would constantly talk about. An image can't see. They would mock, an image can't smell. It can't walk. It can't eat. It can't hear you either if you pray to it. You see, they're impersonal. They're just created matter. But God is alive. He's not impersonal matter. Our relationship to him is personal. We have a relationship with a real person, not a piece of rock or a piece of wood or a piece of paint. Now you think about, painting or pictures that we have. I can't think of any picture. I have of Dana, my wife, but I don't really need to be looking at a picture of her because I have her. She's living. But a lot of people, their spouses died. And like my mother has died. Well, now all of a sudden the value of a picture goes up, doesn't it? We might stare at pictures of our dead loved ones, but they're dead. We don't usually sit around and moon over a picture of someone who's living. Do you see the comparison? God doesn't want us mooning over some lifeless, impersonal picture, which is at its very best, the grossest of all misrepresentations of him, when he's not dead. He's not impersonal. He's close to us, and he listens to us when we talk to him in prayer. He speaks to us in his word like he's doing right now. You see, he's a true and living God. That's one of the other reasons why it's wrong to worship any kind of image that is meant to be a representation of God. And then in the third place, it produces error. I told you this earlier. I'll tell you what, it misleads people. It leads people into immoral behavior. That's what it does. Remember Exodus 32 again. They were making a golden calf, and it was meant to represent who? Yahweh in his glory. And what did it lead to? It led to wild, licentious partying. It led to a shameful orgy. And that's what happens. Same thing with Jeroboam. That's what we see all over the world today. You look at these religions that worship even God as in an image or painting or an icon, and look at their behavior. It's immoral. It's become distorted. It's become defiled. All right, so let's talk about some applications in conclusion. This second command condemns images used religiously today, anywhere in the world, any religion. And so this means, for example, Buddha and Hindu religions, and any religion that uses images, they are to be condemned. And so here's examples of people worshiping the Hindu gods. You can see in all those pictures right there. This is condemned. This is forbidden by the second commandment. And here's an example of people worshiping Buddha, you see. And what we're saying is this is all explicitly prohibited and condemned, and it makes God angry. Well, let's get a little closer to home. This also condemns much of what is found in the Roman Catholic Church. They use images and statues, and the Orthodox Church, and they use icons and pictures. Now, the Roman Catholic Church has more problems than you could enumerate upon. They are an immoral organization, just like the Hindu and Buddha religions are as well, and the Muslim religions. They're immoral. And the Roman Catholic Church specifically they've got more problems than you could talk about in many lifetimes. It is said by Roman Catholics who study this themselves, and for over 30 years, who were priests in the Roman Catholic Church, that 7% of their priests are known pedophiles. Known. I believe the percentage is higher because they probably don't know about it, a lot of them. Over 50% of them are sexually immoral. They rape their nuns. They cover up murder and rape all over the world by moving priests around. They laundry criminals' money, the mafia, cartels around the world, rogue governments. They helped the Nazis get to Argentina after World War II, so they couldn't be extradited to serve justice. They violate the first commandment by worshiping the Pope as if he were God and Jesus. And so you got all these problems in the Roman Catholic Church. And yes, it's by your fruit that you will know them. And the Roman Catholic Church's fruit makes it very clear they're an evil organization. And they have not given up on this murder and everything. The Jesuits, as I said, many are pedophiles. By the way, I wrote down 3 movies or films that I would recommend you watching. One is Sex Abuse in the Church, Code of Silence. And if you watch that, you'll see that when these priests, they know they're pedophiles. You know what they do? They move them to another continent. They just keep moving them around so they can never, be extradited or whatever and serve the penalty. And popes, the current pope himself, they try to influence justice in these countries and get pedophiles who have been pedophiles in these orphans' homes and have lots of evidence and they're convicted. He tried to get them out. And you need to watch this movie Spotlight of the British Boston Globe, how they uncovered many, many pedophiles all over the United States. And this opened up a can of worms all over the world. And another thing I would recommend you watching is Secrets of the Vatican. And this isn't some religious statement. In fact, all those people that worked in the Boston Globe, they were all Catholics. And they came to, and they didn't have anything against the Catholic Church. They were just finding out, man, there's all kind of pedophiles in the Catholic Church among these priests. And if you watch Secrets of the Vatican, these are just media people who worked in the Vatican who have written books, and it's quite telling. And then, of course, you have the, so here's an example of the Orthodox. The Orthodox, they don't have statues, they have icons. And so here's Orthodox icons in their churches. And here's an example of people bowing down and kissing the Pope, and the Pope kissing statues of Mary and that they have representing Mary and Jesus and so on. And they've got many, many problems. Here is a Pope that George Bush, in an interview, said, when the interviewer asked him, he said, when you look into Benedict XVI's eyes, what do you see? And before that, I've seen this live. I mean, I've seen this video several times. And before the guy could hardly finish that question, he says, God. I see God. Well, I'm telling you, this guy's not God. He was very evil. This Pope right here, they're all evil. And they're all violating the first commandment by letting people bow down and worship them. But anyway, what does the Bible say? Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until the rebellion occurs and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the man doomed to destruction. He will oppose and exalt himself over everything that is called God or worshiped. So he sets himself up in God's temple, proclaiming himself to be God. And here's this God that George Bush said, this Pope that George Bush said in the interview, when they asked him, what do you see when you look into his eyes? He said, God. And here's the portrait, the official portrait that His Holiness, you can see right there, Benedict XVI, it's entitled the truth, the way, and the life. A portrait of His Holiness Pope Benedict XVI. That's exactly what they do. They set themselves up to be God. And then, of course, you've got their evil Jesuits. The Jesuits are when you talk about ISIS, when you see anything about ISIS, they are child's play compared to the Jesuits. And you may not know it. I didn't know this until the last year. But I'm telling you, they are evil. And there's 66 Jesuit colleges around the United States, by the way, none in Oklahoma and Texas. And I think it's because they understand how evil I think our forefathers understood and probably never let them in our states. But anyway, they take an oath in which they promise that they'll kill, do anything they can. They take this oath. I've got it. It says, I promise and declare I will, when opportunity presents, make and wage relentless war, secretly or openly, against all heretics, Protestants, and liberals, as I'm directed to do, to extirpate and exterminate them from the face of the whole earth. And when the same cannot be done openly, I will secretly use the poison cup, the strangulation cord, the steel of poignard, the leaden bullet, as at any time may be directed to do by any agent of the Pope or Superior of the Society of Jesus. And when this bloody oath is taken, the Jesuit Superior tells them, go into all the world and take possession of all lands in the name of the Pope. He who will not accept him as vicar of Jesus and his vice-regent on earth, let him be accursed and exterminated. And this is the oath that and they killed millions of us believers down through the years. And they would do it like ISIS today, except they can't. And John Adams, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, wrote, I do not like the resurrection of the Jesuits. Shall we not have regular swarms of them here in as many disguises as only a king of the gypsies can assume? If ever there was a body of people who merited eternal damnation on earth and in hell, it is this society of the Jesuits, of Loyola's. And Abraham Lincoln said, it's not against the Americans in the South alone I'm fighting. It is more against the Pope of Rome, his perfidious Jesuits, and their blind and bloodthirsty slaves that we have to defend ourselves. And I could quote you leaders 20 years ago, the new Prime Minister of Ireland. He quotes people. The dictator of Spain read a communique. Here's Hitler himself. He said, I learned much from the order of the Jesuits. Until now, there has never been anything more grandiose on earth than the hierarchical organization of the Catholic Church. I transferred much of this organization into my own party. And he called Himmler, the main architect of the Holocaust. He said, I see him as the Ignatius of Loyola. Well, Ignatius of Loyola is the one who started the Jesuit order. They have murdered people for centuries, millions, 300 and 400 and 500 years ago. And here's Hitler saying, I see Himmler as this guy who started this evil organization and murdered hundreds of thousands of believers. And so I'm telling you, they've got a lot of problems. And but it like I said, when you start, you remember one of the problems is when you start worshiping images and idols, what did it lead to with the golden calf? Immorality that you can't hardly, you can never wrap your head around. And we see that with the Jesuits. So we see them worshiping these false gods and these idols. Here's what the Jesuits, this was the Council of Trent, 1545, said in their official council, and those can never be repealed or rescinded. They said they are to be wholly condemned who affirm that veneration and honor are not due to the relics of the saints. They say you got to worship saints. Second Commandment says, no, you cannot. Or is it a useless thing that they are to be condemned who say that it is a useless thing that the faithful should honor these and other monuments, and that memorials of the saints are in vain frequented to obtain their help and assistance. So what are they saying? Anybody who says it's wrong to frequent monuments and fails to worship them is to be condemned. And they say we have to do it or we're condemned. And they also say it's not only not wrong to worship images of saints and other sacred monuments, but anyone who says it's wrong is to be condemned. So you get the idea. In 1977, Maria Rubio in New Mexico, just south of Roswell, New Mexico, she made a tortilla. And she thought that she saw a picture of Jesus. And so they talked to their neighbors about it, and all their neighbors agreed, yeah, that's a picture of Jesus. And so she quickly constructed a shrine for it in this little shed in their backyard. And here's the shrine inside look of the shrine. And over the next 2 years, 35,000 people visited this shrine. They brought flowers, they brought photos of the sick and their friends. And she even quit her job to attend to this full-time traffic that was coming into her house. One reporter did happen to say, I read several articles on this a few years ago. And one reporter, like the boy in the story of the emperor with no clothes, said he thought it looked more like Michael Spinks, who was the heavyweight boxing champion of the world at that time. But anyway, in the wake of this, a lot of other Catholics started making tortillas and thinking they saw Jesus in their tortillas as well. And in 1983, other people started making their own shrines of the holy tortillas. They all thought they were seeing Jesus. I'm told in 2005 that this lady who baked this tortilla that she thinks looks like Jesus. Of course, nobody knows what Jesus looks like. She had her granddaughter take it to school for show and tell. She encouraged her to, and she dropped it and went into, many pieces. And right now I'm told that it's in a drawer somewhere. But people since that time, and because of her, they've seen Jesus in their x-rays. They see Jesus on bruises in their body. They see Jesus on stained towels. They see Jesus on a cliff, on a piece of cheese, a breakfast tortilla, and on it goes. I'm telling you something. These are blatant examples of idolatry, what is forbidden in the second commandment. People see it in lava lamps. They see it in cinnamon buns, beehives. A person, when I was researching this a few years ago, they wrote a book on all the pictures of Jesus that people saw, these Roman Catholics. They said, look, it's Jesus. That's the title of the book. Well, I'm telling you something. The Roman Catholic Church comes under the curse of the second commandment. And the reason they are so evil is because when you violate the second commandment, it leads to this kind of pedophilia and rape of nuns and cover up of murder, laundering money of cartels and vogue nations and mafia. You see, that's what it leads to. And so, and I saw last summer that George Bush, they were thinking might convert to Catholicism. Well, I want to tell you something. I would recommend that he read Revelation 18 verses 4 and 5 that says, "Then I heard another voice from heaven say, 'Come out from her, my people, so that you will not share in her sins, so that you will not receive any of her plagues, for her sins are piled up to heaven, and God has remembered her crimes.'" Now, why do I talk about all of this? Well, first of all, I want you to know that there are people who are explicitly violating the second commandment. Secondly, it is because there's a push for people around the world now to go home to Rome. George Bush, the Prime Minister of England, you see these people kissing the Pope, and you see a lot of people proselytizing to this prostitute, Rome. Now, we love Roman Catholics. I know Roman Catholics. Almost every Roman Catholic I know is just a wonderful person. And I know many ex-Roman Catholics who are now believers as well. But we must witness to them about Christ. That doesn't mean that we can act like Roman Catholicism is true, that it's the genuine church. I'll tell you what it's an arm of. It's an arm of Satan himself. And it was long before ISIS came around. So this is a very, the minister of Ireland just 20 years ago, he said to the media, he said, "You guys do not understand how evil the Jesuits are." He says, "They are the Gestapo of the Pope." Most Muslims are the nicest people in the world, but you know what? There's like I think yesterday I saw 0.02 or 0.002 that are in ISIS. And so if they took over the world, even though most Muslims are really nice people and they wouldn't mistreat you, those people would kill you. And most Catholics I know are the nicest people in the world. But you know what? There's a group of them that are Jesuits. And if they took over the world, they would do just what they did before. They would be murdering us by the millions. And so it's an idolatrous, wicked organization. And we worship a true living God. God's alive. He's a living God. Like we said, we don't need pictures of God. We have God himself. So I hope that you have come to understand some things. We haven't talked about all the applications that can be made to worshiping idols, but these are some of the applications. We need to understand these things are wrong. And we need to obey the second commandment. So may God bless you in your walk with him to obey this command.